Howdy, everybody. This is Liberty. I appreciate you showing up. We are joined with by Nolo. He's talking to us today with a brief interview to tell us some things that he knows about. I appreciate you showing up and talking to us. Nolo, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Yep. I'm ready for any sort of apologetics question. We can touch on theology or such, but basically, yeah, God talk, I'm ready at any time.
Awesome. Well, that brings me to my first question. I thought of maybe a brief summary to get us started, to get us rolling, so I thought I'd ask Nolo, do you believe in God?
Yes, I believe in God. That's inescapable. However, unless you put that in a context, it really doesn't mean anything. I mean, I can say that I believe that butterflies migrate from North America to South America, but if it has no impact on my life, I could easily just dismiss it as I could believe it. In other words, if I didn't think about butterflies, it would be no way, that they would impact my life, even if I did. So when you ask a question, do you believe in God, it doesn't just mean a kind of superficial, like the butterflies migrate or they don't migrate. Belief in God means, does this permeate every bit of you? Does this color all your thinking? Are all your concepts shaped by that? Do you see the world, for instance, through God's eyes, or what you would anticipate God seeing them at? So yes, believe in God, certainly, but let me just qualify that with the demons and devils believe in God too, and they don't get any extra credit for that.
Awesome. I'll tell you what, I've been paying some attention around the internet when I visit different forums and stuff. I visit a gaming forum, and I'd say that the demographic there is probably around 18 to 35, somewhere around there, maybe a little bit younger and a little bit older, on variations of the scale. And somebody posted a thread about, do you believe in spirituality? Are you religious? Do you believe in a higher power or not? And the overwhelming result of the poll was, no, I'm not religious. I'm not crazy. I mean, so much so that I was really rather shocked. And I've noticed most of my time is spent on the internet now, and we spend a shockingly small amount of time talking about religion. I'm curious, have you seen any relative flux about the talking of religion, like either in real life around people? I don't know if you go to church or something like that, versus online with people, on a scale of I know you've been on the internet for a while, and you've been around society for a little bit too. Do you think people are talking about religion more or less in these two different arenas?
Actually, it's pretty much the same as it's ever been, okay? But that being said, there are times when the talk, of course, increases, and I see those times during disasters or anything involving a great loss of life or large amounts of suffering or, how shall I say this, objectionable behavior, like a dictator goes wild, slays half the population. Then yes, the talk does increase because people are always trying to find out meanings behind, why did that happen? Or, it's out of their cosmology or their explanation of how the universe works. And so at those points, people tend to question their own cosmology or search around for the pieces that they can find to fit into their own to make sense of the world. And that's all a cosmology is your picture of the world and how everything fits in it. And either God fits in it or he doesn't. And a lot of what you see, like you said, you were on gamer sites and all, well, their focus is upon the fictional world of gaming. And everything is going to relate in their cosmology, their worldview, tending towards that game and that game environment. So God holds all the trump cards, right? He can wipe the deck clean if he wants, or insert what he wants, or at least in their mind. And so there's no room for that sort of worldview to make them feel comfortable with their own. If you've ever played D&D back in the day, Dungeons and Dragons, you started out as a low-level character, and everybody had a lot of good time with it. Well, after a while, levels increased, power increased, abilities increased, and finally, if you developed the character long enough, you got to the point where your character was a demigod. And, you were Heracles or even one of the minor gods, Loki or something. In the ability and the things that you could do, and what people rapidly found out is when you got to that point, there was no fun in it, for one thing, and secondly, it was, if you can do anything that you wanted by wish, then you found out your wishes were kind of hollow. You found out that there was really no substance to them. And that makes you think about life and reality and everything else and your cosmology in general, and you start questioning, well, is there any depth to what I believe? And that makes people uncomfortable. And people would rather not think or self-examine themselves and keep their comfort zone, however they surround themselves with that comfort zone. But overall, I would say people pretty much have stayed the same as it's ever been. I mean, if we were in a Victorian parlor and discussing this, or we were in a Civil War camp, or we were on the banks of the Euphrates, I think the amount of people doing God talk would still be about the same amount. Whether they believed in God or they didn't believe in God, it depended on whether they were searching or not, whether they were comfortable with the world and what they saw in it, or they had questions about the world, and they seek to find some sort of explanation for why things are the way they are.
That's interesting. I was talking to someone else, and they said that usually people that get called to like a religious leaning of one sort or another, it usually happens to them in some extreme moments of their life, like usually at when they're bottoming out and hitting the lowest point, then they'll reach out and find religion. And of course we've had like the societal shared cultural experiences of like 9/11 and the Boston bombings and the Oklahoma bombings. What's interesting is I find that what seems to have been like the first logical replacement for religion started out to be like alchemy, and that eventually evolved into science, and the different disciplines that we understand now. And of course, they're becoming more granular and higher populated at the further, extents of the different disciplines. But I'm finding that it's kind of becoming, maybe trapped in a similar box that religion might have gotten trapped in a while back by kind of sticking to tenets of tradition and tending to not change, and kind of getting focused on accomplishments of the past and basing, a lot of things and, careers and assumptions and things based on those different discoveries, based on science and math. And it kind of stunts the growth a little bit, I think, of some of these systems, and it always seems like there's a new burgeoning system on the horizon, ready to replace the fallen gods of yore, the Titans, and in come the new gods. And it seems like a lot of this, the talk that I've heard now is kind of an intervention kind of explanation of creation, where it's not necessarily we were made by some omnipotent, omnipresent, masculine, patriarchal God, and it wasn't the traditional, origin of species kind of evolution from monkeys kind of explanation. That it's kind of a bit of a mixture of the two, an interpretation, reinterpretation, and kind of a mixture of like possible, like interventions of like more advanced societies, or even, to push it to a farther woo factor, like, alien species or alien, non-terrarian born, species and stuff like that, be they humans or be they whatever. I'm curious with the advancement and kind of, the exposure that this kind of third perspective is getting. I'm curious, how does that kind of? I've noticed that the Pope, and the Catholic Church has made some recent some declarations that are kind of important to moving the religion forward and being kind of not necessarily progressive, but kind of more inclusive into a broader worldview, with saying things like aliens, even if they're not born on Earth, they could still, find solace in God or something like that. I'm not sure. Maybe you know that quote better than I do. Are there ways that this new perspective can kind of be ingrained in maybe a more traditional Catholic perspective, as kind of the church is trying to do, or even with a foot in science, kind of trying to transmute the two and to, synergistically create this third thing that everybody can believe in? Do you have any perspective on how this kind of new branch of understanding plays into some of that?
Well, the church has always tried to explain myths as like you drop a stone in a pond and there's ripples go out from it. And if you just took a snapshot of one of the ripples halfway out, you get only a piece of the picture of the splash that was made when the pebble hit the pond. So you're going to have bits and pieces of I don't want to say the reality of when the pebble hit, but the full picture of when that pebble hit the pond. But you are going to get inklings of it and pieces of it. In other words, not a complete story, not a complete picture, but a partial one. And any number of these ripples can be any number of things that reflect that original reality. So, for instance, I hear a lot of stories about how synonymous the Horus myth is with the Christ myth. Well, if you actually investigate it, there's a wild disparity between the two, and that there's only a superficial resemblance. However, that being said, there is an echo of the God/man dying and resurrection. So in all these little bits and pieces, there are reflections of a true reality. So as far as the myths and stories that can be incorporated into the true reality, it's like different people with different perspectives. Like if you asked one person, you pointed out a building and you asked a general what he thought of the building, and he would tell you about it in tactical and strategic descriptions. You pointed to a child and they'd give you one description, and a housewife and so on and so forth. So if you assemble all of those separate things, you may get an overall picture, some of them being incorrect, but if you weed out the commonality, you might get an overall true picture of it. Now, the church has always done that, and not always, all right. It's done that throughout its history, and it's also incorporated human failings, which anytime a group of humans get together, they put a veneer of humanity upon it, which isn't necessarily correct. The first thing they like to do is organize and make a hierarchy, which, well, you have to have it when you get large enough to make a construct, such as a religion. But that being said, then you add in all kinds of error and human flaws and foibles into it. The true miracle of it is it endures in spite of that. But it was Newton, who was a scientist, who said the reason why he did science was to explain the workings of God. And this has been the church's stance for quite a while. I mean, yes, it went through its superstitious eras, and it went through its human foibles when all they cared about was money, even though people today probably say the same things. Even so, the overall steerage of the church has always been that science and theology go hand in hand. It's like the material world and the spiritual world go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other, or one reflects the other, or they're partners anyway. There's no way at this point, once creation happened and matter was created, there was at that point you can't separate the two. Unlike the Gnostics who like to say we need to discard matter altogether because it's evil and all we need is the pure spiritual, that also is a fallacy. So as far as the aliens out there and how the church is dealing with it, it's common sense. It's how I would deal with it. The main question would be, are they contaminated with the same flaws that we were? We have a history of how we were contaminated. That's, the tree of good knowledge. Now, either these creatures have encountered it or they haven't. If they have not encountered it, I would expect them to be hands-off, stay away, and have nothing to do with us until our conclusion is reached. If they've become contaminated by the same sort of thing, then I would expect at some point we'll probably go out and explain to them how the Creator solved the problems. So, I hope that answered your question a little bit. There's so many ways that can go.
Yeah, that helps clear it up a little bit. I noticed in one of your statements, I was kind of curious, and I wanted to know if you could elaborate on it a little bit. You said if they hadn't gone through the same like human failings or the fall or what mankind has gone through, that we have such an elaborate recording of, that they would be hands off and they would have to wait and see, wait till we came to our conclusion. But what do you know what exactly that conclusion might be, or what a popular belief of what that the possible alternative conclusions that might be reached are?
Well, yeah. In the Christian cosmology, there's I wouldn't say a battle between good and evil, but there's a contamination in the universe with evil, and it's focused on our planet. And the conclusion would be the removal of that evil. So if they're participants, as say for instance the angels that didn't fall that are in heaven, and goodness knows what other kind of creatures that are there. Briefly, there's dimensional creatures mentioned in the Bible. There's things called heights and depths, which I have no conceivable notion what in the world they can be, but evidently they are creatures. They are not participants, but they're spectators. So they're sort of waiting to see the conclusion of the whole thing. And the whole thing is obviously the playing out, does good triumph over evil, or does love conquer all, or does order overcome chaos, in any way that you want to put that kind of archetypical question. So if they aren't contaminated, then they would be spectators much like any other creature, that we're here as an object lesson to those that aren't under the fall, exactly to what lengths the Creator goes to salvage His creation.
Okay, so you're saying they would basically, they would be bound by the same Creator, because of course God would be omnipotent across the universe, so it wouldn't be just the Creator of earth and earthlings and our fallen angels, that they would be hip to their basic rendition of like a planetary religion, because that would be where they were born, and where God's influence was evidenced and expressed on that planet. Can you give us like what you think, like maybe an alien interpretation of religion might be, maybe from Mars, maybe from a planet like in the Pleiades or in Orion's belt or something like that?
Well, if this is, expressive of an overall pattern of the Creator redeeming the universe. In other words, when free will was given, we were given a choice to obey the Creator and basically follow whatever instructions we were created to perform, or we could take the choice of striking out on our own, determining for ourselves what was good for us and what was evil for us, and I don't want to say labeling, but perceiving the world as good and evil through our eyes, not through the Creator's eyes. Now, any number of sentient races could have been presented the same sort of choices. I don't know. Either it's parallelism or we're the singular object in the universe, the sentient race that's been picked to play this out in. I have no way of knowing that, and the Bible's silent on that subject. You know, basically, for all intents and purposes, we're on our own to solve what we've got to solve for ourselves, let alone worry about the neighbor next door. They could be going through the same sorts of processes, or they could be immune from it. It really is a moot point. However, if they are going through the same sort of processes that we're going through, then I would expect to see a parallel process where they have the Creator becoming one of them and going through the process of redeeming them also. So I don't find that far afield. As far as the Catholic Church is concerned, they haven't made that decision either. They're leaving it open-ended to either of those two eventualities that I spoke of. Either they're uncontaminated or they have their own process to go through. That being said, our process is for us alone. In other words, you cannot export Jesus Christ to another planet. He's our kinsman redeemer, which means he was made human, Homo sapiens, which means he was one of us, all right? So for there to be a redeemer of, say, the Kliznos, on Klizmos, he would have to be Klizmos. So that could happen. God is not restricted by any sort of thing like that, but that's such raw speculation. You really can't draw any inferences that apply to us about it, other than what are these things whizzing in the sky that we call UFOs, and what does that have to do with us? The fact that in their behavior, where they leave bits of evidence instead of none at all, which I would expect impartial observer to leave no imprint at all, to leave us really uncontaminated so that we didn't even know we were being watched. That would be my expectation. The fact that we're being watched gives the implication to me, and yet with no evidence or very little evidence, then I have to suspect that they're there to foster a state of mind. That I don't want to say that they're demons flying around. I don't want to take it that far. But I can say that there might be tools used by the adversary to install the state of mind where you perceive a thing and you say, well, I have evidence that this is true. I have some evidence that it's false. I really can't make up my mind between them. There's no overwhelming, way to tip this one way or the other where I can dismiss this out of hand or accept it wholeheartedly. So instead, what I do is I compartmentalize in my mind, and I say, well, I'm not going to make a determination whether this is true or false. However, I'm going to leave it in my consciousness as an item. It does exist. Whether it's false, whether it's true, it exists, and it's a factor in my mind. Now, to foster that kind of mindset, you can see, well, maybe you can't, but you should be able to see how transferable that is towards something like, say, the subject of God, where you can say, yeah, there's evidence for him, but there's also not enough evidence for him. Or the evidence can go either way. Either there is a God or there is not a God. And that fosters in some people the mindset where, okay, I'm going to put it on the shelf. I'm not going to make up my mind one way or the other about it. It's just an item there in my mind. And that, to Christianity, is rejected. That's antithesis of Christianity. That either you do make a decision about it or you don't. And for that, I find the new spirituality of UFOs and all of that sort of thing a further trap in your pursuit of reality or truth, capital letter truth.
Gotcha. So I guess that would kind of be interpreted, in your worldview as kind of like just a new perspective of UFOs versus religion, which was kind of a secondary step of science, like when people weren't imagining, like gods and angels coming down to save them, they started thinking in terms of science and, jet engines and, anti-gravity propulsion and stuff like that, and started thinking of aliens coming down to, save them and protect them as the new savior complex or the new savior fantasy or whatever. I guess that's kind of how, that worldview would be interpreted by a more traditional um, believer such as yourself.
Yeah, but that's the if you want to call it, that's the myth with all of the sting taken out of it. In other words, all you've done is transfer the same sort of, here's our origin, here are our creators, and here's what's going to happen to us. But all of the responsibility, all the moral decisions, and all of the how you live your life is left out of it. In other words, you have all of the goody parts of the creation myth and the and the gods and whatnot up there in the heavens, without any of the repercussions of how you live your life. So in that regard, it's just a retelling of the Christian myth with all of the Christ edited out of it, and a substitute superpower, super creator, super mutant, super alien, whatever, imposed upon that makes no real demands upon you internally. It makes no, it leaves you no choices to make about it. Just simply, oh yeah, it's there, or nah, that's all crap. So that feels comfortable to people because there are no implications whatsoever to that sort of belief. None at all. I mean, if you knew there was aliens watching you with big Google eyes outside of Jupiter, other than the wow factor of it, and gee whiz, isn't that neat, or wow, isn't that terrifying, other than that will make no impact on you, on how you go and how you deal with the people in the checkout line in front of you, or the guy that cuts in front of you in traffic, or the fellow that drops a big fat wallet in front of you and doesn't notice. All of that has no impact. That there's grand beings from Venus watching you has no impact whatsoever upon your real internal spiritual life. So it's easy for those people to grasp that sort of thing, convince themselves that they have a theology, so to speak, or a spirituality, and they have this grand cosmology that extends across the universe, and they can feel good about it without actually imposing any kind of responsibility or any kind of sacrifice or any of those things. No reason to exercise a virtue or reject a vice if you're underneath that sort of cosmology. So yes, I can see that being popular, but I don't think that's anything new. It's like the back in the day, it wasn't UFOs people were chasing; it was elves, it was trolls, it was goblins, it was witches, and before that, and so on and so forth on back. That's always been with us.
Okay, well, I'm curious. Like some of the evidence that people use are different interpretations of biblical quotes, and I know that you're pretty familiar with some of them. Could you give your explanation as to, for instance, why they say, for instance, in the Bible, I think it's in Genesis, they say, we will make them in our image or something like that, where they kind of refer to themselves like as the Elohim, which is kind of a plural of gods. And some people point to that as kind of evidence of alien intervention, because it's not like a single paternal, entity referring to itself. Do you have an interpretation of different quotes in the Bible like that some people might bring as evidence?
Well, there are no direct quotes, but there are inferences. The inference, of course, is the Trinity, which is God is actually three persons in one being. So to say it's a plan of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So I don't find any kind of bamboozlement over that. And here, all right, to get into some nuts and bolts, some real head scratching with it, all right, God's nature doesn't change, and God exists outside of time. In fact, before time was even invented, or basically before matter was invented or created, so to speak, there wouldn't be any time. You need matter to have time. So eternity is kind of a different flow than time as we know it. So if he's unchanging in time, and yet at some point God becomes man, in particular the Son of the one of the Holy Spirit, and he says one of his claims is when he resurrects, is that we too can partake of his nature if we identify with him. In other words, if we claim him as our owner, he'll do the same. And so in effect, if we're one with him, or we're, pieces of his body, and if God's nature is unchanging, then at some point before matter was even created, at some point, in some way, fashion, we were there. We were part of God's nature. So it's kind of like when he looks down and says, let us make man, he's kind of discussing us too, that we were probably part of, not, for instance, the decision-making process, but at least participants in a way of observers, anyhow, in our own creation. I know that's kind of twisting because of the nature of time and that God's outside of time and all of that, but just to give just a couple of examples of how the word let us make man, the plural would be used. Once you get outside of time, things get really bizarre. So it's kind of hard to explain in linear terms that we're used to. How that we can be before we ever were that's. I definitely don't have words for it, and I can just barely grasp the concept myself. But I've heard really lame explanations, like they were claiming that it's the royal we used in the King's English, but no, I have to agree that it was a plural decision. So, and it sort of would have been. If the Father is the initiator of the plan, and the Son is the go-to, the actual manipulator or the doer of the plan, and the Holy Spirit is the upholder or the keeping it going part of the plan, then I could see them all being part of one and the same in a decision-making process, saying, let's have this creation, let's make this creature. And the plan in making this creature is that we'll have a partner. Now, in the beginning, in the Garden of Eden, now it's hard to say might have been, okay? But it seems in the Garden of Eden, when we walk with God and we had that partnership with God, it was sort of, I don't know, it was kind of like landlord-tenant type thing, or owner and pet sort of a thing. We got along fine, we did everything fine, and it was all great, but somehow I think we were missing some part of the mind of God, or the plans of God, or, in other words, there was something not fully complete in it. Now, whether that would have come to completion on its own if we hadn't fall, I don't know. That's raw speculation, and that never happened, and never will happen. But then after the fall, and we got separated from the Creator, the plan was how to get us back to the Creator. And how to do that? I don't know. We ruined ourselves when we took the choice in saying we can determine for ourselves good and evil. At that moment, we died. We died spiritually. At that point, we said we're the masters of ourselves, not God. And that divorce that we had was final. I mean, that carried out through our genes. And that's all we are, is extensions of Adam and Eve's genes. We're the, passed along, but there they go up the ladder till... And their fall is our fall. In other words, that same contamination, that same I want to choose my own way still resides within us. Well, the only undoing of that automatic separation from God, is if a human being with those human genes said, I'm going to obey God. I'm not going to determine for myself what is right or wrong, but I will strictly go along the guidelines of what God said is right or wrong. And so that was Jesus as the man doing that very same thing. So when he died and then resurrected, if we're identified with him, then we also die and resurrect with him. And we get his nature rather than our old fallen nature. In other words, we undo the choice to determine for ourselves right and wrong, and we hand that back over to God to choose what is right and wrong for us and agree with it and go along with it.
Okay, well, that's an interesting explanation. I appreciate it. I'm kind of curious if you can explain to us. I don't know if you're familiar with like the role of religion in history and like various influences one had on the other. Uh, I've always heard that, like for instance, the Nazis were Christians, and they were in some way uh, entwined with or aligned with the Catholic Church. Like for instance, Ratzinger was like a Nazi youth or something like that, and eventually became Pope Benedict. Um, but I've also heard that they had Nordic interpretations and mythology that influenced some of their religious beliefs. I'm curious if you know anything about, for instance, their beliefs, which or possibly the influence the Catholic Church had during like World War II, because it seems like a lot of things changed after like 1945, and like every institution across the board, there was some type of reinterpretation of their role in society and their scope of their project and different perspectives like that. I'm curious. Usually, that's a good place to start with any reinterpretations of that history. Do you have any comments on on that time period and the influence of the two organizations on?
Oh yeah. Well, I would say that there were Christians in the Nazi Party, just like there's Christians in any sort of, or nominal Christians, I would call them. A lot of times you're Christian just because your parents were and they passed it on to you, and it has no penetration whatsoever into how you live your life. So as far as that goes. All right, let me give you a more striking example. Okay, are you familiar with voodoo? Well, voodoo borrows heavily from Christian external ritual and accoutrements, like the statues of the saints and equivalent of holy water and equivalent of salt and rosaries and crucifixes and all sorts of things. Very, very closely related to externally what looks like Christianity, and yet what they use it for is totally diametrically opposite of Christianity. So, like any New Ager that you'll bump onto on the forum, the saucer cults and all of that, they will tell you that their flying saucer is piloted by Archangel Michael, or that Christ is the titular leader of this corner of the solar system. And Yahweh's got this little plot of the galaxy marked out, and there's another one beyond that, and beyond that, and beyond that. Now, to give yourself any kind of ring of authority, it's amazing to me how much they will gravitate towards Christianity or any of the Abrahamic religions to lend that little ring of authority to back up what they have to say about their particular belief system. So as far as the Nazis being Christian, well, they certainly didn't act like it. So I wouldn't pay that too much. I'd take that with a grain of salt. They definitely weren't a Christian organization. That being said, some of the religious organizations, I wouldn't call them Christian either. I mean, there's factions in the Catholic Church I wouldn't even consider Christian. If you were the enemy, where would you be? Would you be way off in the distance, or would you be wanting to be right sitting in a seat at headquarters? So where are you going to do the best damage? Way off in the periphery or right in the center of things? So where I would find the enemy and where I would find the most damage and the most error and the most discrediting, I would find it right dead center in the middle of a religion. So in that regard, yeah, I can see that. And in your comment about 1945, what's interesting also is the rise of communism, and there was a person named Bella Dodd who was in front of the Senate committee dealing with, I think, the FBI and all of these things about communism, and that person converted to Christianity. And in their testimony before Congress, they laid out the plans the communists had to bring down Western civilization, and they knew that the government, the education system, the religious system, and all of those things were, of course, communism in their own country was fighting against, opposing those things, and so they figured to work from within. And she said there was a distinct plan of recruiting communists from there, communists from here, and inserting them in branches of government, to insert them in the educational system, to insert them in the seminaries, and basically grow up within the system and then do things to discredit it. Well, we see all kinds of that in all the churches around it. We see that in our government. We see that in the education system. All of that sort of thing is coming to fruition. Well, if you can imagine the communists doing that as a tactic, you can also imagine any other organization that's basically against God, that's for rebellion and against obedience, doing the same sorts of things. So, it's the weeds and the tares. To say there's one pure organization or there's one pure ideal or something out there uncontaminated, that's unrealistic. That's just foolish. You're going to find a mix in everything, and what you have to do is look for where's the gold in all of this trash? Where's the truth in all of this illusion? How am I going to distinguish what's of God and what isn't? And that sometimes requires harsh things like pain. I mean, it's a common thing that I see on the forum is I can't believe in God because there's pain or there's suffering. I cannot believe God would allow pain and suffering. And yet, I don't know, if you've ever gone through real tremendous pain, what you do realize once you get your mind back, and you're not just hurting and can't think of a thing, once you realize underneath severe pain is all the extraneous, all the trivial, all the crap goes away, that all there is facts in sharp, distinct, black and white relief. You can see things as they are. You don't care for any kind of bullshit. You don't care for any kind of, gorilla dust thrown your way. You can see things without fooling yourself, without lying to yourself. When you're in pain, pain doesn't fool you. In that, pain is a very good guide of what's real. When you're comfortable and you're wallowing in pleasure, any kind of lie can deceive you. You feel good. You don't care. It feels good and it feels better. And it's like, I don't have to examine a thing because I'm where I want to be, because I feel good. And this is what I want. I only want to feel good. I want to avoid pain and I want to embrace pleasure. Well, you'll never see things as they really are. Without that pain, without that suffering, you're going to get comfortable with this terrible trap world that we're in. If it weren't for these indicators that's something wrong, you'd die without knowing it. That's just like being born. There's a medical condition. I don't recall the name of it, but there are people born without pain sensors, and their life is a living hell. Now, because, hey, you'd think, not feel pain? That's marvelous. I could run as fast as I want and do anything I want. I wouldn't feel it. Yeah, but here's the problem. You could be doing damage to yourself and not even know it. Put your hand down on a hot stove, not knowing that it was hot. Run into a sharp table, not notice that it was sharp, and on and on. So the pain and suffering is there as an indicator to let you know that this is not your home. This is not where you belong. And to get you to start seeking where that home may be. Yeah, I'm sorry I've diverted off the Nazi thing, but I find that's just like the New Agers today. They'll absorb the same sort of veneer of Christianity to spout whatever kind of nonsense they have to proclaim. And when you get to the bottom and the root of all of these sort of things, they all tell you that you can be your own God. And that's what the Nazis were telling. They were the superior race, and they just kind of subservient stuck it on one figurehead like Hitler, but it's no different than North Korea or any of those places. The figurehead is God, and if you identify with that God, then, well, you're part of that God. You share in his godhood, and you share in his triumphs and his all of his goodies and his victories. That in and of itself is sort of true, in that we share in the fall of Adam, each and every one of us. If you identify with Christ, then you share in his resurrection. So there is a grain of truth in all of that.
As I'm sure you know, we've got several self-professed preachers and borderline wannabe saviors that storm the halls of the Lunatic Outpost forum, which listener you could check out by going to http:// lunaticoutpost.com and check out some threads. And we've got some people on there that profess to their own divinity and kind of say that they have a distinct communication, with God and the Creator and various incarnations of that moniker. Uh, some of them can be kind of bullying. Some of them can be a little bit rough around the edges, can be kind of mean. I'm kind of curious, do you have any commentary for those characters that you see? And because they really don't come off with any type of New Testament kind of compassion that I would expect from a Christian, in a traditional sense. They kind of are Old Testament brimstone and hellfire and damnation. What's your perspective on them?
Yeah, and some of them are all rainbows and unicorns and dolphins playing in the sunshine. What the commonality between either of those two extremes is that they believe that there's a word for it, but it escapes me at the moment. But basically, God is all and in all, and everything is God, and God is everything. And so to them, they're just expressing their aspect of their godhood in whatever style they feel comfortable with, or whatever they figure will hook the most listeners. The truth of the matter is God, in my cosmology, makes a very distinct and clear emphasis on that there is an unbridgeable gulf between the Creator and the created. Now, to the extent where he extends his hand and says, I can incorporate you in this as partners, as inheritors to this creation that I've made, only goes so far. In other words, you'll never be God, and we'll forever always be creatures. To that extent, and that's why that God makes a distinct impression, especially in Scripture. If you know Hebraic, generally, if you say something, that's true. If you say it twice, you're putting, kind of like, pay attention here, emphasis upon it being a truth that's a deep truth. But if you repeat something 3 times, it's a distinct, eternal, reverberating, permeating everything, this is essential and this is core to everything type of truth. And the time that you encounter that is when God is described or being described, they use the words holy, holy, holy. And holy means separate. It means that God is distinct, a distinct being, as opposed to any sort of created being. And that you can say that you're in God, or you can say that God is in you, but in no way is that interchangeable. There's no way that you could be God, or that you could take his place. Or, in other words, one of the temptations of Christ was the offer that this whole mess that's become creation can be all undone. In other words, the adversary would leave. He would take evil with him, and all of that would disappear. He'd take all of his toys and go off, if only Jesus would declare him God. Well, that's an impossibility. That's, by definition, you can only have one God. But the attempt was there for there to be another God. And that's what the all-in-one crew, in their heart of hearts, that's what they see as possible. That at some point, enough reincarnations or enough ascensions or enough self-illumination or self-denial, if you're a Buddhist, whatever it takes, you can achieve the same point of godhood that the Creator sits at. And in my cosmology, that's just a rank impossibility. So for me to listen to would-be gods and supposed messiahs and all of that sort of stuff on the forum, to me that's no more that's no, I don't want to say evil, but that's no more bad than being, a sports god, being, the number one baseball player, the number one football player, or the movie star that everyone looks at, or the best other thing. It just seems to be a bit blasphemous in that you're aiming in the direction of wanting to be God, or claiming to be godlike. But other than that, it's to me, I see it as just another human foible, and how they play that out, is that's their style. If they're brusque or Old Testament-ish, they're just adapting a style to lend credence to what they're saying. There's something to the when Jesus talked and they said, who is this guy? He's just a carpenter. Num. Overall, what the impression you got is people discussed among themselves is, how is he saying what he's saying? He speaks with such authority. And that's just the ring of truth to things. And I think that's what a lot of them, by adapting a style, are trying to put on that ring of truth to what they're saying.
Gotcha. Yeah, I agree that it usually works out to be an authority thing. That's why they kind of, like people with kind of fascist, behavior are kind of attracted to it, because it's got like an absolute authoritarian perspective to it, if taken to its, a negative extreme in that sense. Another current event that's occurred, we recently had a forum split at Lunatic Outpost, where Disturbed, the forum owner, created two subcategories to the main page, one being an investigative corner, the other being kind of a spiritual and religious studies. And there was much ado on the forums. There were Christians who complained that they have every right to be on the front page. They don't want to be in a sub forum that's only Christians, because they, to quote them, it's literally preaching to the choir. And much of the Christian religion requires that people reach out and proselytize or whatever, and try and kind of convert people and bring them in. That's a basic tenet, it seems like. I'm curious. And of course, there were other people who were very pleased, to have a place dedicated for them to be able to reach out and talk to each other and not get trolled and, ad hominems tossed at them every second, and personal attacks were frowned upon and moderated. I'm curious, do you have any thoughts on this? Do you have any observations on how it's manifested itself over the past couple of weeks, and where you see it going into the future?
Well, I'm glad to see that a sub-forum was made, okay, because at times that may be your only interest. Some forums are split off on just UFOs only, or cryptozoology, or historical things. That's nice, because to go there directly, because that's simply your focus, and that's really all you're interested in. In that regard, I like it. I also like it because it does siphon off scriptural quotes, just quoting for the sake of quoting, as if it's like a magical formula that will do something. That's just as foolish as those thinking you'll hold up a Bible and it'll make the devil run away. It's so in that regard, yeah, I like having that sort of thing off the front page. As far as forever separating it, I don't think you can, because if this is a conspiracy site, in my cosmology, one of the grandest conspiracy of all is how the adversary is hoodwinking us and basically making governments and individuals dance to his tune. Now, to quote scripture or something, that's not very productive towards pointing that out. Not really. I mean, discussing the human condition, that will point things out, and that will make people wonder. And it's to provoke questions is really the job of a Christian, is to provoke why do you believe what you believe? You have several assumptions and things that you take for granted, and basically you've been hoodwinked into believing what you believe through whatever circumstances you come through. But an unexamined life is a crime, I feel, and even secular philosophers believe the same thing. So to have a place where you can kick things about in detail that would bore or be disinteresting to the rest of the forum, yeah, that's nifty. And to keep the pests off the front page with scripture quotes that are basically waving their little magic wands around hoping to change people. And it's nice, yes, to keep them off the page so that they don't have an excuse now that they should go where they can do that sort of thing if they want. But I can guarantee you they're going to find short shrift in that sort of forum also, because that's pointless. Here's a misperception. It's like the Ten Commandments. The Ten Commandments aren't for the heathen, so to speak. They're not for those that don't want them. Ten Commandments are there for those that desired them, that wanted those sort of guidelines, that wanted direction, that wanted, a hedge to keep them from falling over the cliff, so to speak. So the same too with Scripture, that's not necessarily for the edification of those that are numb or don't want to hear, that are deaf. It's for those that have woken up to the fact that I don't want this world. Now, what's the way out? And you can peruse to, however deep you want to discover the way out and what you have to do with it. But as far as proselytizing goes, I think you could just leave it at the fact that there is an alternative to the way that the world is presenting things to you. And that, yeah, Christians should get a fair chance at being able to present that as anybody else, as a Buddhist, as an atheist, as a communist, as anything can, But I understand really the behind the scenes creation of that was for the nuisance parts of why are you posting these scriptures? What do you hope to achieve by it? Are you just trying to make people feel bad? Well, you're only making yourself look like an idiot. So, in that extent, yes, I'm glad they did do the sub-forums.
Okay, Nolo. We've had some discussion about you putting together a theology show. I'm curious if you've got any ideas what kind of direction that it's going to be headed in, if you want to make any announcements on a date or a time. If not, no big deal. But I think it would be interesting. Maybe you can tell us more about the topics you would cover.
Well, I would like to. I'm sorry. I would like to discuss topics that are I see repeated over and over again. Now, I don't want to get into niggling things. I don't want to discuss Scripture as, well, this quote says there were 5 people listening, and this quote says there were 7. My God, throw the whole thing out. They're full of error. I'm not real interested in that sort of thing whatsoever. There's good explanations for it, but if you can't see that right off the bat, then there's no use trying to dig into minutiae for you. I'm more interested in, like I said, the human condition. I'm more interested in things like why is there pain and why is there suffering, or why doesn't God do things, why is it so hard? Why aren't things spelled out in flaming letters across the sky? That sort of thing I'm sure everyone is interested in. The Christian cosmology has a different kind of viewpoint on why those things are. And I think the discussion of why I've adapted that viewpoint might or might not, and we'll see, might be interested to some listeners. And a lot of it is misperception, misconceptions about what Christianity is all about. I've heard this repeatedly, that basically it's a list of forbids. Don't do this, and don't do that, and don't do the other, and don't do... which is, missing the whole point of what you can do. And that the actual list of don't do's are for your own good. Maybe they require, explanations. Maybe they don't. But I'd be happy to explain why they are the way they are.
Well, Nolo, you did get my attention on that last sentence. because you look back 500 years, it was not a happy time for Christians. Why? If you're going to put all that Christianity stuff, there's a really dark box that you apparently crawled out of at this point. Because that's scary shit, man. It developed most of Europe for a couple hundred years.
Yeah. Let's just take, for instance, the Inquisition, which everyone thinks that was a witch hunt and it was kill the infidels and et cetera, but actually in its formation, and to this day, the office of the Inquisition is still there, by the way. It's just called Doctrine of Faith and Morals or something or other. I can't remember the exact name. My mind doesn't work when I'm on microphone. But anyway, that it still exists to this day. And the point is just like I was telling you about the testimony of Emma Dodd in the Senate Committee on Communism. Ella Dodd, I'm sorry. Bella Dodd. Yes, thank you. My editor is correcting me. At the time in Spain, there were infiltrators that were pretending to be priests and infiltrating their way in and telling the people basically that whatever it is they wanted to tell them, well, it's okay to have sex every time, all the time, or it's okay to assassinate the king, whatever sort of agenda they had. In particular, I'd have to research, but the bottom line is to weed out the fake priests that were infiltrating the church and teaching whatever it is they wanted to do. The Inquisition was to bring these characters in and basically ask them catechesis, the things any Catholic would have known. And a lot of times they were either Muslim or Jewish or whatever, and they were just pagans, and didn't know the answers to these questions. Really it was to get to the root of who were the saboteurs, who were the imposters. And it extended a little ways out from that, from people that adapted these ideas that the infiltrators put in, and to weed them out of positions of authority or teaching in the church. As far as the common person went, well, there was no effort, and that was like, trying to sweep the ocean with a broom. There wasn't any effort to correct that. It was figureheads, people in authority, people that other people listened to, that were disseminating error, that were being identified and either told, look, change your ways, or, let's drop this priest outfit. Drop your camouflage. You want to be a heathen, be a heathen. You want to be Muslim, be Muslim. But don't pretend to be a Catholic and try and influence the church. And overall, the numbers of that were died, I know I've heard figures of millions, but in the actuality, I think that the true number that were killed, actually executed in the Inquisition, were less than 100. As far as those tortured and whatnot, might have reached maybe 300. That was just the obstinate ones. Now, to realize this was a very cruel time period, and people thought nothing of, the king rode by and kicked the peasant in the face. So there was no niceties about things back then. So, yeah, they weren't as gentle and OSHA approved as they are now. But overall, the Inquisition was not the complete witch hunt and kill the infidel that it's painted and propagandized as today.
Right, but this has been going on for, thousands of years. This is nothing new.
Oh, yeah. I mean, one of the letters of Paul, I think maybe one of the letters of Jude, just off the top of my head, are concerning that, of infiltrators, imposters, pretenders that are in there for whatever agenda they had. There was a lot of Gnostics because they glommed onto Christianity like nobody's business. They saw a framework they could exploit. And from the earliest days, from before it hit 100 AD, there were infiltrators and imposters and pretenders in Christianity. So the fact that there's dark forces around is nothing new. Read some of Malachi Martin's book, Smoke in the Sanctuary. It goes right to the depths of the Vatican. There was a mention early on by Liberty about the Jesuits, which, as God's warriors, they were defenders of the truth. They were the ones that were tasked with bringing science, rational thought, reasoning into the Catholic Church, into theology. It was felt at the time that it was maybe perhaps a bit too mystical, or it had grown the way of too mystical and too esoteric, and perhaps too divorced from common reality, cause and effect, and that sort of thing, and wanted to basically put the feet back on the ground that, yes, what you believe theologically does have basis in reality and, in common day-to-day ordinary science and everyday things. Now, how that was used and distorted and through time and history and individuals in the order, well, yeah, that's a whole thing. But that's a history of anything. That's a history of any political movement. That's a history of any sort of ism. Or, talk to a Buddhist. If you stuck an ordinary Buddhist today in front of Buddha, he wouldn't recognize him. He'd faint and die of shame and embarrassment if he found there were statues of himself and people burning incense in front of him. He'd be appalled. He'd probably kill himself rather than think to allow that sort of thing to happen. So that's the incrustation of what humanity puts a veneer on things. You've just got to learn to expect that sort of thing and see through that sort of thing to the core and the essence of, the true spiritual, what shall I say, the template of what it is that you're looking for. That's just the nature of truth. As we are down on this planet, it's going to be encrusted. Truth is going to be encumbered and clothed and camouflaged and covered up in mud with all sorts of things. The whole idea of the cosmology of Christianity is to be able to say and delineate what is the crud and what is the truth beneath it.
Well, you know what, Nolo? I have a question for you, too. This is Rush. You mentioned political correctness at some point, and that was my first thought right off the bat, was like, this is still political. Why we keep people that supposedly are trying to help us in positions that they're not doing very good jobs, and this has gone through history. That's what I'm talking about.
Yeah, and usually the alternative is always worse. It's a thing where those that desire power, of course, they're going to seek it, to find it, grab it, and get it. But those are usually the ones most unsuited for the job, most unsuited for power and whatnot. So until we come up with a system where we pick the person that least wants it, we're always going to have a mess. It's just the nature of the suffering. It's the nature of the pain. It's the nature of the playing field. That's the burden of what we have to live under. And the fact of the matter is that just points out how bad things are, how out of kilter things are. And this is something that everyone has said to themselves at one time or another, whether the bread falls down on the floor and goes bloop, butter side down, or what. You repeatedly say to yourself, that's not fair. Life's just not fair. It's not fair that so-and-so did whatever to me. It's not fair that I didn't get a break that so-and-so got. And yet, our own experience and the experience of the universe shows us that there is nothing fair. We can look up with a telescope and see galaxies colliding, and we wonder how many billions of sentient races are going, right now, being extinguished. How could that possibly be fair? Well, the idea is no, it's not to look fair. It's not to be fair. It's not fair, because this is not our capital H home. This is not where human beings were intended to be. But this is the consequences and the things that you have to go through because you decided to go your own way. This is the only way that it can be illustrated to you that your own way is poisonous. Because part and parcel, you don't get just the icing on the cake. You have to go through the pain of making it. You have to go through the crap to get any good. So you're never going to. And this is what people keep looking at. They keep expecting Christians to be perfect, or Christianity to be, or the church to be perfect, or religion to be perfect. And that's a fool's errand. It's not going to happen.
I'll tell you what, man. Texans, they butter both sides of the toast. So keep that in mind.
Well, yeah, you can always hedge your bets. You can always cover your bets. You can always, and I'm sure there's lots of so-called Christians that are so because they're simply covering their butt. It's like, well, if all of this is true, then I better have a parachute. I better have an insurance policy. I better have a backup plan. And I got God in my back pocket. I'm okay. While meanwhile they go on, living like utter hell, living how they please, with themselves as their own God. So God ain't fooled by that sort of thing, by the way. But anyone looking at those sort of hypocrites will say, "Oh, well, yeah, that's Christian. See, I would never be a Christian. Look at what hypocrites they are." So, to some extent, we all are hypocrites. I mean, we all have this fallen human nature. We're all going to fall flat on our face. I guess what would separate a Christian from a non-Christian is one has got a home to go to, and the other, I'm not so sure where they're going.
Isn't that a little bit rhetorical?
Okay, Nolo, I'm curious. Can you give us your interpretation of the new Pope? I've been seeing a lot of articles, especially around the end of the year last year, about how great he's doing and how much respect he's got from a bunch of people from the kick-ass job that he's doing. How do you think he's doing? How do you think he compares to the last Pope, and where do you see the future of like some of the decisions that he's making?
It's a difference in style. The previous Pope Benedict was trying to eliminate wiggle room. He was trying to define things more. He was very very much the academian. So he was good at what he did. If you had a moral question or an ambiguity, he was very good at finding, like a Supreme Court, finding enough precedent and finding enough examples and that sort of thing to come up with a decision under new circumstances to be applied to. In that, he was pretty good. The new Pope has decided to take a different tact. Rather than concentrate on the things within the church, technical difficulties, he decided to concentrate on those things outside of the church. So he decided not to de-emphasize the hierarchy, to de-emphasize the ritualistic aspects, to de-emphasize the do's and the don'ts, so to speak, and rather return to the roots of what the embrace of the church meant, especially in the early days. The idea that we're all under this pain and suffering, and that the Christian cosmology holds the answers to that, or at least the explanations of it, not necessarily the cure, by the way, but at least the reasons and the why-fors to it. And that our job, like any human's job, is to assist each other. I mean, we've heard of the old illustration or analogy of they opened up one room in hell, and it was everybody sitting around in a table with very long spoons, and they were all complaining and whining and starving because they couldn't reach their mouth with the spoons. The spoons were too large, and that was hell. And you go to the next room, and it was heaven, and it was the same sorts of people and the same table and the same spoons, and they were all feeding each other. So in that regard, this is what this Pope is trying to emphasize, is let's all build each other up. As far as the technical aspects of how we do that and how we run that sort of thing, we've sort of run that avenue into the ground, okay? It doesn't seem to be getting to the world at all, okay? There's a place for that, but that's just not working. So he's going to emphasize what the core values, what the core purpose of the church is, and that's just to take care of the hurting. We're all trod under by this system, and it would be a whole lot easier if we were all helping each other out rather than everybody grabbing their own. And so in that emphasis, I like this new Pope. I like what he's doing so far. I do have the background coming from some of the Protestant things that see the Pope and Roman Catholicism and all of that as the Antichrist, which is a good smokescreen to distract you from the real one that comes along. But in any case, I'm not going to defend Catholicism or the Pope in particular from those sorts of charges. I mean, there's enough parallelisms and there's enough indicators to say, yeah, that might be. But then I've seen the same as applied to George Bush, and I've seen it applied to Saddam Hussein, and I've seen it applied to communism in general, and all of that sort of thing. So I'm going to take that all, with a grain of salt. That's sort of those nuts and bolts things that if you wanted to get into, I could get into, but it's profitable really for nothing other than your own sense of curiosity. But actually, it means nothing. It's like you're saying, you're impressed by, or the world seems to be impressed by the Pope, by his actions. And so that's what I would look at. I would say, what's the fruit of all of this? If it's that evil, well, then we'd find ourselves more and more enslaved. But this Pope seemed to be saying, hey, let's get rid of this, foxhole mentality where you have all these bishops with fine garments and palaces, and the peons don't have a chance in hell of speaking to him. And instead, let's put on ordinary work clothes, let's mingle with the people, and let's do some good where we have leverage, and let's do some good. So in that effect, I can see, yes, that I can say, yeah, he's a good Pope. That being said, there's also indicators where I'm slightly standing back, observing too, not wholehearted cheerleading either, because when he speaks of there being what he'd like to do with the world economy, what he would like to do with, putting it under one central fair, not distribution, but fair arrangement so that everybody got a fair shake. Where he's talking about, he would like to get rid of the idea of nationalism, where it didn't lead to conflicts. And so he's sort of speaking the foundation things of what I would expect a one world leader to want and look for. So in that regard, I am kind of standing back just a bit, just seeing which way this goes.
That's a good explanation. I appreciate your time and your perspective, Nolo, and thank you for joining us. I appreciate the listeners for tuning in and giving us a listen. You can check out our threads at lunaticoutpost.com. It sounds like Nolo's got a show coming up about theology pretty soon. Is there anything you'd like to say before we get out of here, Nolo?
Basically, yeah, thanks for the opportunity, and thank you for a good interview there, Liberty. And, yeah, if anybody has any particulars, I keep my eye on the forum, now both of them, the religious forum, and in fact, this would probably be best suited for the religious theology subforum, whatever they call it, is if you have any specific questions or you have any kind of specific comments that you want included on whatever little next, fireside chat type thing I might do, put them on there. I collect them, and there's a lot that needs to be answered for in regard to the church. There's a lot of people that have questions that I keep seeing that occur over and over that basically either Christians don't want to tackle, or basically there's no answers out there that I've seen adequately, for the questions that are out there. So, good. Thank you very much.
Absolutely, Nolo. And everybody, you take it easy, and we will talk at you later. Have a good night.